Hello, everyone. Hopefully the audio is alright and I'm not talking too loud or too quietly. But it was requested of me that I do a book reading, that I do some form of audiobook. Some people use these to apparently fall asleep to, other people apparently listen to me while they're exercising. So I decided I would be a gentleman about it and I would oblige them. So today, upon suggestive request, we have American Dreamer, A Life of Henry A. Wallace, written by John C. Culver and John Hyde. We'll go ahead and skip through the epilogue. We'll get to chapter 1 right away. Henry Aggard Wallace was born October 7th, 1888, in a modest frame house on an isolated farm in Iowa. It was a golden autumn day, and farmers across the state could work outdoors without a coat. Harry and May Wallace, a young couple enjoying their first harvest season as husband and wife, occupied themselves with the routine of country life on their new tenant farm in Adair County. May, barely 21 years old, picked flowers in the yard and fixed lunch for her husband. Harry, only a year older, fed the cattle and hogs and did his usual chores. Shortly after sunset, May gave birth to a boy. About the birth there remained little lore. It was a quiet birth on a farm, the way Wallace women had borne babies for generations. No doctor or midwife was present. The nearest town, a tiny village called Orient, was 5 miles away by dirt road. Like most farm families, Harry and May Wallace saw no need to record the event beyond a notation in their Bible. Family members would learn of the birth in due course. Their firstborn child reached manhood and held high public office before he finally obtained a birth certificate. This was the way of birth in Iowa, as normal as husking corn or rising at dawn. Yet nothing about the Wallace family ever quite fit the norm. The Wallaces were different. They were part of, but apart from, the general husbandry of Iowa. They were smart and innovative, and eager to take the lead. Unlike most farmers of the day, Harry had been to college and was a believer in book farming, the application of scientific principles to agriculture. His young wife had also been to college and was trained in music and art. Like most Iowa farmhouses, Harry and May Wallace's home had no toilet, electricity, furnace, telephone, or running water. But it did have books and a piano, and it was brimming with ideas. Nor was Harry a typical tenant farmer. The landlord in Harry's case was his own father, the Reverend Henry Wallace, and he was a man to be reckoned with. By 1888, Henry Wallace was a major landholder in Adair County, publisher of the largest local newspaper and editor of the state's most influential farm journal. Governors sought his counsel, political parties wanted to put him in the U.S. Senate. Henry Wallace was a sort of small-town leading citizen writ large. High-minded and strong-willed, he embodied virtues country people hold dear, honesty, duty, frugality, charity, simplicity. He even looked the part. He had sandy hair and twinkling blue eyes and full lips bent into a patient smile. The beard he wore throughout his adult life gave his long, narrow face a gentle and dignified appearance. Small wonder that by the end of his life he was almost universally beloved, known to thousands of Midwestern readers as Uncle Henry Wallace, a member of the family. Personal wealth and power did not interest Henry Wallace, although he gave his own family a measure of both. What consumed him was his mission, a belief that man must worship God through service to his fellow man. And the men Uncle Henry cared most about were farmers. Only by creating and sustaining a vibrant agricultural civilization, he thought, could the nation secure its future. This belief, the cause of religion and duty and agriculture rolled into one, he stamped indelibly on the Wallace family name. This was Henry Aggard Wallace's inheritance from the hour of his birth. "Remember," the boy was told as he grew up, "you are a Wallace and a gentleman." It was his glory and his burden. The Wallaces' practice of naming their firstborn sons Henry, together with an assortment of middle names, was and is a source of confusion to everyone outside the family. The patriarch of the clan, Henry Wallace (1836 to 1916), had no middle name or initial. His son, Henry Cantwell Wallace (1866 to 1924), was known as Henry to friends and family, and H.C. to business and political association. Cantwell was his mother's maiden name. Harry Wallace's son, Henry Aggard Wallace (1888 to 1965), was called Young Henry throughout his youth. As an adult, he was usually called H.A. by associates and Henry by family members. His middle name was in honor of Horace Aggard, a prominent Methodist minister related to his mother. The Wallaces had been farmers in Scotland and Ireland for countless generations. The first of the clan to arrive in America was John Wallace, who left from Kilray, Ireland in 1823 and landed in Philadelphia at age 18. From there, he walked to western Pennsylvania and put down roots, which, to Wallace, meant farming. Over time, John Wallace made himself a figure of local importance, a man others in the area turned to for agriculture advice. In 1836, his first child, Henry, was born on the farm. Henry Wallace would later write lovingly of his boyhood on the farm, of its fat pork sausages and cream as thick as pancake batter, But as a boy, he dreamed of being elsewhere and doing otherwise. At 18, Henry climbed aboard a railroad car, the first train he had ever ridden, and headed west. For the remainder of his life, Henry Wallace was an eloquent exponent of farm life, but he never again lived on a farm. His tickets off the farm was the ministry. It was probably the only profession his religious parents would have found acceptable. After finishing the theological studies at Monmouth College in Illinois, he taught school for 2 years in a tough little town in northern Kentucky. In 1863, he married a petite, fine-boned young woman named Nancy Cantwell, daughter of an Ohio landowner and politician who had died while leading a cavalry charge in the Second Battle of Bull Run. The first years after the marriage were not easy ones. Parishioners in his small Presbyterian churches in Rock Island, Illinois, and Davenport, Iowa, were hidebound and difficult. Their strict orthodoxy did not appeal to him, and they found his social gospel altogether too broad-minded. The young minister and his wife tried to cut costs by living in a boarding house, but still had a hard time making ends meet. In the final months of the Civil War, he accepted an appointment as a chaplain in Northern troops, an experience that left him with a permanent horror of war. Shortly after the war's end, the couple's firstborn children, Mary, died in infancy. By the 1860s, Henry Wallace was emotionally spent and physically exhausted. "I would suffer the most excruciating pain after any severe exertion, generally on Sabbath night after preaching 2 sermons," he later wrote. "My limbs would become cold and it seemed impossible to get them warm." A move to Morning Sun, Iowa, southwest of Davenport, improved his health for a time, but after 6 years his old ailments had returned in force. His 6-foot frame, which comfortably carried 200 pounds during good times of health, became dangerously thin. He suspected he was dying of tuberculosis, consumption, he called it, a disease that virtually destroyed his entire family. One by one, over a period of 12 years, his 7 brothers and sisters and his father had all died of some sort of lung trouble. None of his siblings reached the age of 30. With a small inheritance left by his father, Wallace had begun buying land in Adair County, a couple hundred miles to the west, and in early 1877 a doctor advised him to move there. "I will give you 6 months to live if you continue in that pulpit," the doctor said. "It's either out of the pulpit or into the boneyard." So, at age 40, with a wife and 5 small children, Henry Wallace left the pulpit and moved west. The ancient struggle between prairie and forest, waged for centuries on the soil of Iowa, had not been fully resolved when pioneers came with their horses and plows. The state's location and climate gave neither grass nor trees an undisputed claim to the land. Iowa was neither east nor west, neither arid nor tropical. Iowa was midway and moderate. When the settlers arrived, grass was in the ascendancy, but trees still covered about a quarter of the state. Adair County, south and a little to the west of the state's center, was at the front line of the battle. When Henry Wallace began buying land there, much of Adair was still raw prairie. Blue-stem grasses standing 8 feet tall covered much of its 24 square miles. Trees, which Easterners took to be a sign of good climate and fertile soil, were as scarce as people in the state of Adair. Madison County, adjoining to the east, was a different story. There the land was nicely forested. Farms and small towns had flourished in Madison for a generation. Henry Wallace inhabited both sides. He moved his family to Winterset, a prosperous small town that served as the seat of Madison County, and saw to his farms in Adair from a buggy. He thrived on being outdoors, and his health soon began to improve. Within 5 years, he was fully recovered. Farming land that had never been farmed was a tonic to Wallace. He introduced the first short-horn bull, the first purebred hog, and the first peckercorn horse to Adair County. Old-timers said it was impossible to grow clover in that part of the state, and Wallace took an almost spiritual satisfaction in proving them wrong. But he also knew that intelligent farming practices alone were not enough to ensure the success of agriculture. Soon he was engaged in preaching of a different sort, trying to help farmers understand the political and economic forces that shaped their environment. A year after arriving in Winterset, Wallace was invited to give the town's 4th of July address and proceeded to roast machine politics, excessive party loyalty, and mediocre schools. He finished up with a blistering attack on cheap money, a nostrum highly popular among farmers of the area. Among other things, I said that we had doctors, mostly politicians, who were doping the public under the pretense of curing evils, old grannies with their paregoric and catnip tea in the shape of greenbacks and fiat money, intended to soothe the present discontent and to cause the people to forget the incipient growing pains of the country, etc., etc. The address set off a furious storm in Madison County and plunged Wallace into the county's vigorous newspaper war. For a time he contributed to the local Republican newspaper, the Madisonian, until falling out with the publisher over editorial control of his copy. Wallace responded by purchasing a half-interest of the Winterset Chronicle, a forlorn little paper with only 400 readers. I then started out, as an independent Republican or freelance, ready to meet all comers and goers in the journalistic field, he wrote. In 10 months, the Chronicle's circulation had increased to 1,400, and Wallace bought the paper's remaining half-interest. Within 2 years he took over his rival, the Madisonian. He relished controversy. Nothing else is so harmful to the sale of paper or a book as to have it absolutely ignored, and abuse is often much more effective than praise. So, it was abuse I wanted. All but destroyed by disease before their move to Winterset, the Wallaces now were robust and flourishing. The newspaper quickly became a family enterprise. Freckled red-headed Harry, a sunny, energetic boy of 13 when his father bought the Chronicle, earned $3 a week sticking type, cleaning presses, and delivering copies. Unlike his more dignified father, Harry reveled in the company of the rough-hewn men in the print shop. From them he learned the art of chewing tobacco, a practice he maintained for life. Increasingly, Henry Wallace's names and writings were cited around the state by friends who shared his view on agriculture and reform. Among his allies were James Tamajim Wilson and Seaman Knapp, 2 men Wallace met at an agricultural meeting in 1879. Over the next quarter-century, Wallace, Wilson, and Knapp would leave a remarkable record as authors, educators, and public servants. Wallace became one of the nation's leading farm journalists. Wilson served 16 years as Secretary of Agriculture. Knapp founded the Extension Service, which raised American agriculture from superstition to science. Their first joint venture was an effort to break the barbed wire monopoly. Iowa was then in the process of being fenced off. So-called herd laws made farmers liable for damage their livestock did to neighbors' crops, and barbed wire was the cheapest and most effective type of fencing. But the manufacture of barbed wire was protected by patents that gave the Washburn-Mowen Company of Worcester, Massachusetts, an effective monopoly. Wallace, Wilson, and Knapp responded by forming their own organization, the Farmers Protective Association, to manufacture its own barbed wire and sell it at a price lower than Washburn-Mowen's. Only farmers who paid $1 a year in dues to the association were eligible to buy its wire. Thousands of farmers across the state recognized the bargain and joined up. When the Washburn-Mowen Company challenged the association in court, claiming its patents were being violated, the association used the members' dues to fight back. The court battle lasted 5 years, but in the meantime, the association sold thousands of tons of barbed wire to Iowa farmers. Long before the disposition of the case, however, the barbed wire monopoly had lowered its price to meet the association's competitive challenge. The association, represented by the young Des Moines lawyer A.B. Cummins, later a prominent progressive Republican and U.S. Senator, eventually prevailed in the U.S. Supreme Court. After winning its cause, the association disbanded. By 1883, the 3 friends had become men of no small influence. Together, they had created the Agriculture Editors Association to promote independent farm journalism, and the Iowa Improved Stockbreeders Association to foster modern livestock practices. They had staged a coup of sorts at Iowa State Agricultural College, the state's lethargic land-grant institution, and installed Knapp as the Professor of Agriculture. Wilson had been elected to Congress, and Henry Wallace, small-town newspaper owner and gentleman farmer, had been named the editor of the Iowa Homestead, the state's largest and most important farm publication. Soon thereafter, the owner of the Iowa Homestead found himself overwhelmed by debt and sold the paper to James Melville Pierce, a big-boned, hot-tempered small-town newspaper publisher. Wallace was retained as editor with an annual salary of $500 and a promise of complete editorial independence. The deal was sealed with a handshake. Wallace plunged into his editorial duties with boyish enthusiasm, pressing the mysterious power of clover to enrich the soil while feeding animals, slashing the political and economic interests standing in the way of agricultural success. The paper, of which I was then editor, was not really so much of an agricultural paper as it was an anti-monopoly paper, he acknowledged. The management soon found that the anti-monopoly was the winning card. Wallace reserved his highest dudgeon for the railroads, the most potent monopoly of all. His biggest coup was an expose of the railroad's discriminatory rate structure. The stories led to the electoral defeat of Iowa Congressman William P. Hepburn, a powerful friend of the railroads in Congress, and the subsequent creation of an Interstate Commerce Commission to govern rail rates. Henry Wallace moved to Des Moines in order to be closer to his duties at the Iowa homestead, but continued to maintain a home in Winterset. There, Harry grew restless setting type. In 1885, at 19, Harry headed off to Iowa State Agricultural College in Ames. The experience was not invigorating. The college was nominally an agricultural college, but very little agriculture was taught, Henry Wallace wrote. Harry, hard-working and quick-witted, soon figured out he knew more than his teachers. By the end of his second year, Harry had more or less had his fill of academia. During a visit home, he learned that one of his father's tenants planned to leave, and saw a way out of Ames. "How would you like to have me for a tenant, on the same terms you have been renting for?" Harry asked his father. Henry Wallace assented, and Harry packed his bags for Adair County. The farm that Harry Wallace took over was large, some 300 treeless acres, and lonesome. Prairie wolves, as the farmers called coyotes, howled in the night, and rattlesnakes hid in the tall grass. The nearest town, Orient, was scarcely a town at all. Greenfield, the county seat, was 10 miles to the north. Farming under any circumstance was hard enough, but without the help of a spouse it was nearly impossible. In the summer of 1887, soon after moving the farm, Harry proposed marriage to a handsome young woman he had met at Iowa State. May Broadhead was an Easterner, born in New York City, but her parents died of tuberculosis before she was old enough to form a memory of them, and she was sent to live with a strict Methodist aunt in Musatane, Iowa. Harry Wallace, 21 years old and a sturdy 5 feet 8 inches tall, arrived on a new trotting horse he had arrived for his courtship of May. He accepted his proposal forthwith. She had never lived on a farm and knew nothing of its labors, but she possessed an adventurous spirit. Harry made farming seem most romantic, she said. May spent the entire remainder of the summer learning the arts of baking and homemaking. On Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, 1887, Harry Wallace and May Broadhead were married. Harry sold 2 pigs and bought a Surrey to transport May and her trunk back to the farm. The house wasn't much, May Wallace recalled, a little story-and-a-half tenant house. Nice enough, but with none of the conveniences, and not a tree near it. Nothing but a windmill. But it was a good farm. May's introduction to farm life was harsh. Iowa had suffered 3 extremely cold winters in a row, and January 1888 was the worst of all time. Temperatures reached 40 degrees below zero in parts of the state, Fahrenheit. More than a century later, it remained the coldest month on record in Iowa. Wood for fuel was scarce, coal was expensive, and corn cobs burned too hot and too fast. By the time the ground had thawed, Harry was ready to begin planting. By the time the ground had thawed and Harry was ready to begin planting, May was pregnant with their first child. In the spring, they set about to make the place a little bit less forlorn. In an effort to break up the farm's treeless monotony, Harry planted a grove of catalpa trees, along the property's edges. The big spreading trees, distinctive for their long seed pods, took hold, and the farm was informally ever after as Jesus help me. And the farm was known informally ever after as the Catapla Farm. Thank you for bearing with me. They also planted mulberry bushes, maple trees, plum trees, and a small apple orchard. The business end of the farm, that which aimed to make money, was livestock. Harry raised purebred shorthorn cattle, Poland China hogs, Petron horses, and feeder cattle. The later were full-grown steers, purchased at an age of 2 to 3 years and kept for 6 months or so until they were finished or ready to market. If a farmer was lucky, he would earn enough by selling cattle to pay his cost. Hogs would eat the remainder of the grain and supply the margin of profit. But Harry wasn't lucky. Corn, which sold for 32 cents a bushel in 1883, brought only 24 cents in 1888. A year later, the price of corn dropped to 19 cents, its lowest value in more than a decade. The price of cattle and hogs suffered similar declines. The problem was the market, one of those cyclical downturns brought about by surplus commodities and broad economic conditions, which no farmer, not even one as industrious and intelligent as Harry Wallace, could surmount. As Harry and May struggled to survive on the farm, Henry Wallace was in Des Moines with problems of his own. The Progressive Republican cause, or Anti-Monopoly Republican as Uncle Henry called it, was suffering a series of setbacks. Henry was especially disappointed when his friend and ally, Governor William Larrabee, refused to run for the U.S. Senate. Wallace rejected an overture from Democrats that he stand for the Senate on their ticket. As progressive Republicans lost ground, cheap money populists under the banner of the Farmers' Alliance gained strength, much to Wallace's discomfort. In 1889, to the astonishment of everyone, farm unrest led to the election of a Democratic governor in Iowa for the first time since 1852. And there was trouble of a more personal sort. James Pierce, the Iowa Homestead's vile publisher, began suggesting that the paper could do with less talk about monopoly and railroad rates and taxation. Wallace agreed to devote his attention mostly to agricultural subjects, but when he learned Pierce had accepted an offer from a Chicago firm to write favorable stories about his products in exchange for a lucrative advertising contract, he was livid. Wallace believed that his personal reputation was threatened. But the Wallaces could do little more than bide their time. Uncle Henry now owned about a third of Iowa's homestead stock and was in a poor position financially to walk away from it. Harry and May had committed all of their energy, plus a good part of May's modest inheritance, to making a go of it on the farm in Adair County. They wanted, indeed needed, to stay and succeed. The toddler running about the farm knew nothing of the family troubles, of course. For young Henry, these were days of carefree adventure. His earliest recollection was of riding to town in a bobsled on a cold winter day, kept warm by snuggling under rugs spread across the laps of his elders. His playmates were his uncle Dan Wallace, Harry's younger brother by more than a decade, and a Scotch collie named Shep. From Dan he received his first pony ride. From Shep he learned the art of catching flies and burying bones. The biggest trauma in his life was finding himself lost in a cornfield, his socks full of sandburrs, and yelling for help. "Where is Mama's baby?" he cried. No, I'm not doing voices. You can't pay me enough to do voices. And excuse that if you happen to hear that. It would appear I did not turn off my ringer. The old prairie flowers still bloom in my memory, and the smell of the pennyroyal perfumed prairie hay still haunts my nostrils, Dan Wallace wrote 4 years later. I can remember the cellar where we won't want to retire when the dark clouds rolled up at the close of a hot summer day. I think I could still pick out the beam in the haymow where we killed the big rattler that was brought in from the field in a load of hay and mowed away one day. Henry and I shared our first common misfortune when we laid away Shep, whose good judgment did not extend to a careful scrutiny of things such as sickle bars and rattlesnakes that do their work under the cover of waving grass. Still, something was wrong on the farm. Dan could feel it when he visited during summers. Cholera broke out among the hogs. A purebred short-herd herd had to be sold off to meet expenses. The cattle were sold for less than $100 a head, a third of what they had cost. 2 handsome black gelding hearses were sold at a sacrificial price to the fire department in town. May Wallace had used her small inheritance to buy Suffolk sheep and shorthorn cattle for the farm. Those were sold too. After 5 years of struggle, Harry and May began to have second thoughts about the romance of farming. They had worked hard and had 2 healthy children. A daughter, Annabelle, was born in 1891, but not much else to show for their effort. Many years later, Henry A. Wallace summed up their plight in a single sentence. "My father had started to work farming when prices were higher than when he had quit." Harry decided to return to Iowa and finish his education. An invitation from Tama Jim Wilson had spurred the decision. By 1892, Wilson had retired from Congress, and at Uncle Henry Wallace's urging, accepted an appointment as Iowa State's Professor of Agriculture. Looking for ways to strengthen the school's program, Wilson asked Harry to come back and finish his degree, after which he would be appointed to the faculty. Harry took the deal, and in the fall of 1892 packed up his family of four and moved to Ames. Henry A. Wallace arrived in Ames a shy boy, not yet 4 years old, who had almost never seen children his own age. The move did not improve the Wallaces' family's fortunes. In Des Moines, Uncle Henry's running quarrel with James Pierce grew nastier by the day, and his financial situation more perilous. The election of the Democratic Grover Cleveland to the presidency in 1892 was followed by a 4-year recession that left Wallace temporarily unable to make ends meet. His land holdings, then about 800 acres, were mortgaged, and his name was on banknotes totaling some $30,000. The Iowa homestead cut off dividends to pay for construction of a new building, and the salary Wallace received was not enough to pay his living expenses. For many years thereafter, Henry A. Wallace later remarked, I associated the word Democrat with hard times. Henry Wallace scrimped along at Iowa State with just enough money for his family to survive. They lived in a tiny house by the Northwestern Railroad tracks. In young Henry's mind, the new home was a place forever whipped by wind. Tumbleweeds and Russian thistles rolled across the yard and piled up against its walls. The sound of window panes shivering in a cold winter evening would always remind Henry A. Wallace of Ames. Henry managed, during that first year of the panic, to complete 2 years of coursework in a single year. The year left a terrible scar, however. Harry fell ill with typhoid fever, and, without quite admitting to his family how sick he was, came close to death. The illness seemed to have affected his gallbladder. For the remainder of his life, his son believed, Harry Wallace was never in first-class health. In late 1893, while still bedridden with fever, Harry Wallace was awarded his bachelor's degree and appointed associate professor of dairying. May Wallace was the family stalwart during those bleak days. She cooked and mended and gardened, nursed her husband, and cared for her children. It was May who taught her oldest son how to read and how to plant seeds and how to worship God. She was a religious woman, raised in the families of Northern Protestant churchmen, and the strict habits associated with her stocks were deeply ingrained in her. May was abstemious, and thrifty in the extreme. She did not drink alcohol or even coffee, and greatly disapproved of tobacco. Salads, she thought, were some new-fangled notion that was being foisted upon the American people by women's clubs. For women's clubs, with all of their good works and gossip, she had no use whatever, despite the frequent pleas of her mother-in-law to participate in them. Even if she had wanted to join them, she had no time. What she couldn't have, her son observed, she had no use for. Yet there was nothing dour about May Wallace. She was good-humored and had a spunky quality that greatly appealed to her father-in-law. May alone seemed to be able to put Uncle Henry in his place when he became particularly demanding. I am not a Wallace, she would remind him cheerfully. I only married one. Relations with her socially conscious mother-in-law were, on the whole, less amicable. For young Henry, these were agreeable if somewhat isolated years. His father was working hard at the college. His mother was busy with a growing family. A third child, John, was born in 1894. He knew few other children. He did, however, have a fondness for plants, and that led him to form the most unlikely of friendships. His pal was a tall, slender black man, 30 years of age, whose name was George Washington Carver. Carver, the son of slaves, wandered through the Midwest for years after the Civil War before becoming Iowa State's first black student in 1891. There, his gentle manner, enormous dedication, and religious devotion won him wide acceptance with the students and faculty alike. Among Carver's friends was Harry Wallace. First as a student and then as a professor, Wallace spent hours with Carver and regularly invited him to his home for dinner. There Carver met young Henry, the boy who loved plants. Carver took a fancy to me and took me with him on his botanizing expeditions, and pointed out to me the flowers and the parts of flowers, the stamens and the pistil, H.A. Wallace recalled. I remember him claiming to my father that I had greatly surprised him by recognizing the pistils and stamens of redtop, a kind of grass Agrostis alba, to be precise. I also remember rather questioning his accuracy and believing that I recognized these parts. But anyhow, he boasted about me, and the mere fact of his boasting, I think, incited me to learn more than if I had really done what he had said I had done. More important, Carver had a sense that all living things possessed something divine, that God could speak from the parts of a flower or a blade of grass. Their walks continued for about a year, after which the Wallaces left Ames, but young Henry had permanently absorbed the philosophy of his gentle friend. Carver received a master's degree from Iowa State in 1896 and moved to the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, taking with him only a few bulbs of the amaryllis plant he loved so. Young Henry and his friend did not see each other again for almost 40 years, by which time the boy had become Secretary of Agriculture, and Carver was world famous as a chemist who developed hundreds of uses for the peanut and the sweet potato. Not until then did Wallace really understand how Carver had connected so strongly with him as a child, why Carver's philosophy of plants had so affected his own. Such botanists as Carver are exceedingly rare, but today they are increasingly important because the day fast approaches when the spirit of man must go out into understanding living things which is much further as it has gone forth into the understanding of steel, cement, machine tools, oil, gas, roads, and airplanes, Wallace said many years later. The ability to understand life in all of its varied manifestations is the supreme criterion of man. By the time young Henry was walking through the fields around Ames, his father had become a small-time publisher of sorts. Uncle Henry's son-in-law, Newton Ashby, had publicly supported Grover Cleveland during the 1892 campaign, alone among the Wallace clan, and had been rewarded with appointment as U.S. consul to Dublin. Ashby was thus obliged to rid himself of the Iowa Farmer and Breeder, a small livestock journal of little note and marginal profitability, of which he was the principal owner. Henry Wallace formed a partnership with Charles F. Curtis, a fellow faculty member at Iowa State, and bought the semi-monthly for a small amount of money. They moved it to Ames, renamed it Farm and Dairy, and began to concentrate mainly on dairying work being done at Iowa State and its extension station. The paper's narrow focus and relative obscurity did nothing to discourage Henry Wallace's taste for controversy. In the spring of 1894, Wallace and Curtis began to have questions about the integrity and scientific findings of an experimentation chemist, and wrote a letter asking the college's board of trustees to investigate him. If the board refused, they added, they would publish their own report on him in Farm and Dairy. The board weighed the matter, decided to take no action against the chemist, and added that any Iowa State professor who published criticism of a fellow staffman would be forced to resign. It was the wrong thing to say to a Wallace. Farm and Dairy promptly defied the board and published a scathing attack on the chemist. A bitter brawl broke out on the Ames campus, roughly pitting the academic faculty against the extension staff, and eventually forced the resignation of Wallace, the chemist, and 2 other faculty members who had joined the fray. Curtis was told to drop his interest in Farm and Dairy if he wished to remain on faculty. At the same time, Uncle Henry's long feud with James Pierce was coming to a head. He was determined either to regain editorial control of the Iowa homestead or be fired. His first move was to write a 1-paragraph editorial telling farmers it was time for the Rail Commission to hear from them on the subject of the rate increase. Every farmer should send a postcard to the commission on the matter, Wallace suggested. The editorial did not appear. The next week he wrote a longer editorial on the issue and handed it to the print foreman with the instruction, "This must go in." Again the editorial failed to appear. Wallace told Pierce to call a meeting of the paper's boards. The issue of editorial control had to be settled. Pierce agreed, but for 3 weeks no meeting was called. Finally Wallace called his own meeting of the 3-member board, presented it with a long editorial denouncing the rate increase, and moved that it be published. This was promptly voted down, and then the battle was on. Every day Wallace showed up at the homestead, expecting that his head likely would be found in the basket, but Pierce bided his time until February. Then, on 1 hour's notice, Wallace was summoned to a board meeting, summarily fired, and told that his pay would end in 3 days. "I was then an editor without a paper," Wallace wrote later. Moreover, he was a major stockholder in a company over which he had no control. He had no way to sell his stock, and he could expect to derive no financial benefits because the company had ceased to pay dividends. The Wallaces had hit bottom. Henry Wallace, almost 60 years old, and his son Henry Cantwell Wallace, nearly 30, were without jobs and without money. Their prospects looked as bleak as Iowa in February. The Wallaces came to their own rescue. A few days after his ouster from the homestead, Uncle Henry traveled 30 miles to the north to see his son in Ames. There, Harry suggested to his father a plan: take over as editor of Farm and Dairy, and turn it into a publication of general interest to farmers. Uncle Henry agreed on the spot. In early March, the little journal appeared with a new name, Wallace's Farm and Dairy, and a new editor, Henry Wallace. In later years, Harry Wallace tended to sentimentalize the episode. He had made the suggestion, Harry wrote to a friend, because he knew Father would die if he could not have a platform to stand on and continue his work. He added, it did not seem a very hopeful prospect, but on Father's account it was the only thing to do. In fact, the Wallaces plainly had more to gain than to lose. The paper already existed, at least in embryonic form, so the cost of getting started was not large. Uncle Henry had a well-established following, which had greatly eased the difficulty of defining their paper's identity, and the Wallaces had, in themselves, an energetic and inexpensive workforce. The paper was a family affair from the outset. Uncle Henry was editor, Harry handled business matters, John sold advertising and subscriptions, and Dan helped in the print shop. In time, even Uncle Henry's wife assumed the role of Aunt Nancy and offered a page of homemaking advice to farm wives. The name of the paper was Wallace's Farm and Dairy. The apostrophe, quite deliberately, was placed after the S. In Wallace's, mind you. What they lacked was money, but there, too, the Wallaces found ways of making do. Temujin Wilson signed a banknote for $5,000 and renewed it each year for 5 years. Harry mortgaged the house he had purchased in Ames and used a life insurance policy to borrow another $5,000. Curtis, who harbored academic ambitions and was eager to sever his ties with Farm and Dairy, took a note for his share of the paper. From the start, the Wallaces were extremely aggressive in both their business and their editorial dealings. An editorial penned by Uncle Henry in the first issue, entitled "A Word Personal," set the paper's moralistic tone. In it, Wallace detailed the reasons why he had been fired from the Iowa homestead and verbally declared war on Pierce. No grief or loss of any kind has ever befallen me that has given me so many sleepless nights as the fact that I was suspected of being privy to details of a corrupt character in connection with the homestead, he wrote. Lest anyone miss the point, Henry placed a box statement on page 1 declaring, Mr. Wallace for 10 years, up to February 1895, the editor of the Iowa homestead. His withdrawal from that paper was the culmination of trouble between him and the business manager as to its public editorial policy. Mr. Wallace wishing to maintain it in its old position as the leading Western exponent of anti-monopoly principles. Failing in this, he became the editor of the Farm and Dairy, over the editorial policy of which he has full control. The statement continued to run on the front page of the Wallace's Journal for several years. Pierce, not one to turn the other cheek, published his own version of Wallace's departure, declaring that the homestead had felt obliged to rid itself of an incubus. A bare-knuckle fistfight broke out. This was no squabble between businessmen. It was a struggle between good and evil. Uncle Henry Wallace, casting himself as the underdog, let no one doubt which man sat with the angels. Subscribers and advertisers were encouraged to choose sides, the result being that virtually every gain for Wallace was also a loss for Pierce. Scores of farmers formed Wallace's clubs in support of him. Club members received a discount on the normal subscription price of 50 cents per year. More important, they became part of a moral crusade. Henry Wallace stumped tirelessly across the state, a fat pad of subscription forms always stuffed in his pocket. The result was a huge outpouring of support for the Wallaces. The cloud that had hovered over the family for half a decade broke apart and scattered. Within weeks, it was apparent to Wallace and his sons that Wallace's Farm and Dairy would succeed. At the end of 3 months, the paper registered a small profit. That year, 1895, is one of the most memorable of my life, Henry Wallace later wrote. It brought me what seemed to be one of my greatest troubles and witnessed the beginning of my greatest success. Above all, it made me understand more completely than ever before that people generally will stand by a man when they see that he is serving them faithfully. In the fall, after 6 months in operation, the Wallaces changed the name of the paper again to Wallace's Farmer and Dairyman, and began publishing weekly rather than semi-monthly. And in January 1896, they moved the entire operation, Harry Wallace included, to Des Moines. Young Henry was 7 when he arrived in Des Moines. He had never been to school, although he could read well, and he still knew few children his age. His interest in plants far exceeded any other interest. In my early life, I would say that I thought completely in terms of seeds, plants, and farming, Wallace once remarked. At that time, I had no thought of public life. Des Moines brought the boy a quick, sour taste of life, as it existed above the level of plants. Harry Wallace moved his family to a house in a lower middle-class area north of downtown Des Moines. His playmates had great disdain for those better off than themselves, and there was a certain roughness about the Northsiders that jarred the quiet Wallace boy. At the Oakland Elementary School, where he entered the first grade, young Henry exceeded easily. His initial taste of success came when a teacher asked whether oak trees had flowers. The class unanimously, except for young Henry, said they had not. With typical certitude, Henry insisted that oak trees did indeed produce flowers. He knew because he had seen them. When the teacher came out on my side, I was very much puffed up, Wallace recalled. The mere fact of having demonstrated a knowledge which the other children didn't have caused me to seek for more psychic returns along the same lines. I'm sure I must have made myself quite a nuisance to my companions, because they weren't in the slightest degree interested along those lines. The first year in Des Moines also marked young Henry's first brush with partisan politics. The election of 1896 pitted William McKinley of Ohio, embodiment of Republican conservatism, against the Democrat William Jennings Bryan, the 36-year-old firebrand agrarian from Nebraska. Bryan's candidacy terrified Iowa Republicans. He was handsome and charismatic, hailed from a neighboring state, and offered debt-ridden farmers an appealing solution to their problem: inflation. No Republican presidential candidate had lost Iowa since the Civil War, but in 1896 it seemed possible. Both parties waged the most extensively organized campaign in the state's history, and the Wallaces jumped in with vigor. Harry, in particular, was strong for McKinley. Young Henry's first political memory was of walking the streets of Des Moines with his father, counting yard signs with pictures placed in windows of home favoring McKinley or Bryan, and concluding, to Harry's great relief, that the Republicans would win. Wallace's Farmer and Dairyman was officially neutral. Editorially, it endorsed neither candidate, but a series of stories written by Uncle Henry purporting to analyze Bryan's cheap money plan in a nonpartisan manner made it patently clear the Wallaces favored McKinley. James Pierce, Uncle Henry's bitter foe, greeted the articles with scorn. A cartoon in the Iowa homestead portrayed the elder Wallace as a clown walking along the top of a fence. An agriculture editor in his great nonpartisan acrobatic act, said the caption. Wallace fired back with an editorial entitled The Satanic Instinct, and accused those who attacked another's character of being cowardly instruments of the devil. On Election Day, McKinley carried Iowa by about 65,000 votes and won the presidency, but the outcome did nothing to quiet the feuding journalist. Pierce published a special 8-page edition, outrightly accusing Wallace of having accepted a bribe to publish his anti-Bryan articles. Shameful political venality, said a large headline. Henry Wallace charged with selling his opinions and changing them to make them salable. Wallace fired back with 2 stinging editorials and a $500,000 libel suit against Pierce. It was regarded as a very unusual thing, in fact, almost unheard of, for one publisher to secure judgment against another publisher for libel, Wallace wrote. I would not have brought the suit, but for the evident maliciousness of Mr. Pierce's article, and I thought it was time to put a stop to this sort of thing. Wallace eventually won a $1,500 judgment against Pierce, which was sustained on appeal by the state Supreme Court. The election of 1896 marked the full restoration of Uncle Henry's reputation. His influence among farmers was unparalleled, and with the Republican Party he was in high favor. Wallace was no reliable partisan, he would never be that, but his contribution to the Republican cause could hardly be overlooked. H.G. McMillan, the state Republican chairman, said Wallace was, without doubt, the ablest and most forceful agricultural writer of his day. With the election settled, Iowa Republicans began quarreling over the spoils of victory. All Republicans thought Iowa had earned a seat in McKinley's cabinet, but they were split over whether to ask for the War Department or the Justice Department. It was Uncle Henry who offered the perfect answer. Iowa was the outstanding cultural state of the nation, Wallace told McMillan, and an Iowan should be Secretary of Agriculture. McMillan asked on the spot whether Wallace himself would be a candidate for the position. Wallace declined at once. Instead, he proposed his old friend, Tama Jim Wilson. In one stroke, Wallace had redirected the state's political attention to its true economic interest, agriculture, and given Iowa an enduring claim upon the federal government's attention and support. And in March 1897, Wilson became Secretary of Agriculture. He remained in that position under 3 presidents until March 1913, the longest cabinet tenure in American history. With some good reason, Iowans often called him Henry Wallace's secretary. The decade that followed the founding of their farm journal had brought the Wallaces little but good fortune. The great financial panic that had seized the country during the Cleveland administration eased, and the farm prices at last began to increase. Corn that bought 14 cents a bushel in Iowa in 1896 could be sold for 52 cents a bushel 5 years later. The threat of pitchfork populism, which so discomforted Uncle Henry, vanished with the financial panic. Progressive reformers such as Robert La Follette in Wisconsin and Albert Baird Cummins in Iowa began coming into their own. As farmers began to prosper, so did the Wallace's paper. In December 1898 they changed its name once again. Henceforth it was simply called Wallace's Farmer. On the front page, below the paper's name, the Wallaces added a credo that summed up in 6 words what they and their paper stood for: good farming, clear thinking, right living. The paper the Wallaces produced was compact, usually 18 to 24 pages, and crammed with articles by, for, and about farmers. The model draft horse, potato culture, scabby sheep, trees on the farm, facts about hog cholera. There was a page devoted to news about hogs, a page for dairy farmers, a horticulture page, a market page, and Aunt Nancy's Hearts and Homes page, sprinkled with inspirational poems, recipes, and homemaking tips. Letters from readers were an important element of all farm journals, and Wallace's Farmers contained dozens of them on every conceivable farm-related subject, from how to burn dead hogs to baking bread in cold weather. Page 2 was Uncle Henry's domain. There he editorialized on the evil of monopolies, urged better farm tenancy laws, counseled farmers to refinance their debt, and preached the virtues of grass. During 1897 he wrote a series of gentle, eloquent letters to the farm boy that warmly sympathized with rural children's desire to see the world, but urged them to hold fast to agrarian values. Don't go west, young man. Don't go to the city. Go to the agricultural college, and go to the agricultural end of that college. When it suited him, he was not above a bit of moralist outrage. News that the way of Christ help me here. The way of the Pottawatomie County Fair was populated by mobs of drunken, howling men and dirty, greasy, filthy, disreputable females drew a heated rebuke. Pottawatomie, or something like that. Okay, anyhow. In print and in person, the Wallaces displayed a shrewd talent for promoting the welfare of agriculture, and, not coincidentally, their farm journal. They sent corn trains and dairy trains and good roads trains around the state to lobby for better agriculture, marketing, and transportation. They formed clubs and sponsored competitions and imported experts to foster scientific farming practices. They helped organize the Corn Belt Meat Producers Association and other groups to press the farmers' claws. Nothing, however, so succeeded in cementing the bond between rural readers and Wallace's Farmer as Uncle Henry's Sabbath School lessons. No feature was more popular or gave the paper greater credibility with religious-minded farm folk. Henry Wallace himself said the Sunday school lessons were the single greatest cause of Wallace's Farmer's success. They were, he wrote, about the best work I have ever done. Readers across Iowa, and eventually far beyond, began to use the lessons in their home devotionals and to prepare for church meetings. Wallace's Bible lessons became an institution in Iowa, as much a part of rural life as potluck church suppers and the Saturday night bath. Mothers read the lessons to their children, farmers read them to their hired hands. Many farmers who claimed no faith whatever in scientific agriculture said they subscribed to Wallace's Farmer only to read Uncle Henry's Bible lessons. Wallace continued to write these weekly lessons for the rest of his life. They provided him with a pulpit far grander than any he occupied as an active minister. From it he could preach his liberal, loving theology to parishioners who came to regard him as a spiritual advisor and personal friend. At the time of his death in 1916, Wallace had a backlog of unpublished Sunday school lessons large enough to last 2 decades. Wallace's Farmers continued to publish Uncle Henry's lessons until 1936. Within 2 years of its founding, Wallace's Farmer had around 20,000 paying subscribers, several thousand more than the Iowa Homestead had when Wallace left it, and the family launched into a vigorous campaign to double that number. After 5 years in business, the Wallaces had retired their debts and were paying themselves regular salaries. Uncle Henry received an annual salary of $3,000, Harry and John somewhat less. In under a decade, the Wallaces had moved from small-town rented quarters to a 4-story, modern, fireproof building in downtown Des Moines they had built to house their plant. The Wallaces' rising prosperity was reflected in Harry Wallace's rapidly improving circumstances. Young Henry could remember a day, not long after the family removed to Des Moines, when he took a walk with his father and looked longingly at the new wood-frame houses being put up in the middle-class neighborhoods. "If we could get a hold of $900, we could build a house like that of our own," Harry told his son. 2 years later, Harry Wallace moved his family to another large rented house on the west side of Des Moines. The house was a large, ramshackle affair with sagging floors, but had sizable acreage, which greatly pleased Harry's garden-loving wife and son. By 1902, Harry had enough money to buy 10 acres on the west side and construct a new home that cost more than $5,000. Finally, in 1912, Harry moved his family south of Grand Avenue to the city's wealthiest neighborhood. There, he built a brick mansion that cost some $50,000. Indeed, the Wallace's farm paper began to make so much money that it was referred to in journalism circle as Wallace's gold mine. Uncle Henry was almost embarrassed by the thought of it. Never comfortable with financial matters anyways, he established a trust to handle his personal funds and simply ceased to think about money. The trust provided Wallace and his wife with a small annuity sufficient to meet their needs and distributed the rest to charities and family members. He enjoyed, thereafter, a life of comfortable geniality and great celebrity. He lectured, traveled abroad, preached, and corresponded with what seemed to be hundreds of friends. Preachers and poets, farmers and presidents sought his counsel. The broad front porch of Wallace's house on Sherman Hill, the quiet Victorian neighborhood where he had lived since coming to Des Moines, played host to the famous and the unknown. Asterisk. 3 Secretaries of Agriculture had lived in the house Henry Wallace built at the corner of 37th and John Lind Road: H.C. Wallace, H.A. Wallace, and E.T. Meredith, who served in the position briefly during the final month of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. Numerous prominent people visited the home while it was owned by Harry Wallace, including Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. In 1970, John D. Rockefeller Jr. stayed there and observed how nice this simple little country place is. His sandy hair turned gray, his body thickened to 220 pounds, his health grew steadily better. One eye went blind for reasons never understood, but his other eye retained perfect vision and allowed him to read widely. He still liked to argue. Testing the wits of bright young men was a favorite pastime, but his prickly temperament grew smoother. "Those were the happiest years," Wallace's youngest son, Daniel, once said. "With all the lawsuits settled, a paper of our own goings, no business or political brawls to upset father's digestion or trouble the goodness of his spirit, and with money coming in regularly, the agrarian uproar had died with the populist and Granger breakdown. Now everything was farmers' institutes, chautauquas, acres of diamonds, stuffs, self-improvement. Father went out and trooped for the new day in agriculture all over Iowa." End of chapter 1.